Hi, this is Eli Ochiltree of the SnoKing Beekeepers Association for our third Wednesday monthly meeting, October 20th, 2021. When we get to the topic, after a short business meeting, it will be on beekeeping tools throughout history. Not just beekeeping, but the tools that the beekeepers use, how they get things done, what they use to do it. But while I was doing all this research on historical stuff, I ran into Shakespeare, and everybody loves Shakespeare, right? Even if we don't totally understand what he's saying. So I had to put this in. I keep running across these really old references to bees, and they thought they knew a lot. We think we know a lot. I keep getting surprised. And boy, in Shakespeare's time, would they have been surprised to find out that the head of the hive is not really the head, but the ruling monarch is a queen, not a king. So it's kind of fun to read back. Oh, that's the early 1500s. That's already 500 years ago. Here's Shakespeare with one of his great little speeches. He's talking about bees, and he says, they have a king and officers of sorts, where some, like magistrates, correct at home. Others, like merchants, venture trade abroad. Others, like soldiers, armed in their stings, make boot upon the summer's velvet buds, which pillage they with merry march bring home to the tent royal of their emperor, who, busied in his majesty, surveys the singing masons, building roofs of gold, the civil citizens kneading up the honey, the poor mechanic porters crowding in their heavy burdens at his narrow gate, the sad-eyed justice with his surly hum, delivering o'er to executors pale the lazy yawning drone. Okay, I had to do a little Shakespeare, just every once in a while it makes me feel good. But it is interesting. They thought that the hive was run by a king. We now know it's a queen. They probably thought all of the workers were male, but the people who actually worked with the bees knew a lot more. Shakespeare never let science or anything stand in the way of good poetry. Fact, reality, history, he never let that stand in the way of a good play, a good plot, and good development. But it is interesting how much they did know. And I love singing masons building roofs of gold. So the next time you're listening to your hive hum when the bees are all busy, think of them as singing masons building roofs of gold. And I'm not sure at the end if the drones are getting kicked out of the hive or if they just mean lazy bees weren't tolerated. Delivering over to, it sounds like execution, executors pale, the lazy yawning drone. Of course, I never let not understanding Shakespeare stand in the way of enjoying it. So, seriously speaking, this is our third Wednesday meeting. Usual contact information. I would ask everyone, you must already be getting the newsletter, but I'll have to put out an announcement somehow that Gmail now requires sometimes that an address be on the safe sender list. And sometimes the safe sender list is you have sent an email to that address, so now it's an okay address. But if it comes unsolicited, like a newsletter, and such as sending the newsletter from a SnoKingBKA.org address that your email may not have seen, or may not have seen exactly Eli Ochil at SnoKingBKA.org. There seems to be some problem with that, but thank you so much for showing up. Winterization, I know, is always on everybody's mind. Hopefully most of you have finished and are feeling good about it, but I promise quick presentation and we will talk all you want about winterization, but there is the YouTube recording of last month's meeting on the YouTube. If you put in SnoKing Beekeepers Association in the YouTube search, we will come up, probably even SnoKing Beekeepers. I am getting beginner certificates out. If I haven't sent individual emails to everybody, but I requested 9 or 10 of them for the people who started their class July 26th, and it ran kind of late. but they are coming. Washington State Beekeepers Association. Their newsletter just came out today. They are going to be asking people to complete a survey. The survey is a little tricky because the purpose of the survey, one side is using the survey of a political movement, sort of, and for one purpose, and one side is using it for the other. In the last legislative session, our lobbyist, Tim Hyatt, who writes an article in the newsletter that just came out, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of it. It should be on the website, wasbod.org, if you didn't get it directly delivered to your inbox. And who knows with whatever this change was. But that survey is going to deal with protection for pesticide applicators from spraying pesticides on our hives. Sounds really weird, but it's a little convoluted. But if somebody gives you 24-hour notice that they're going to spray pesticides in your area, is that adequate for you to protect your hives, which you may not even live next to? You might have an out apiary. That is really the issue that's causing the problem with this. And the survey is supposed to help resolve that. What would you like out of things? So that was one of the issues that came up. So read the article by Tim Hyatt in the newsletter carefully. And I would have included some kind of discussion about it if I'd had time to really think about it. Next class is already starting. We have beginner and apprentice running now. Beginner starts again right before, actually, the week before Thanksgiving. Can't do anything about that. If we're going to get done by Christmas, we needed to start then. Apprentice, we just need to wait until January to start the next one. And journeyman, we had to set a time, January 6th. And we're pretty much sticking with 6:30 p.m. for classes, unless we ever do a Saturday class. Now, the presentation. This is a rough draft, but it was really fun getting as far as I've gotten on this. There is an incredibly wonderful book by an incredible author. It's The World History of Beekeeping and Honey Hunting by Eva Crane, who died about 2008, I think, after a long, very fruitful life in which she was responsible for putting together a lot of knowledge, a lot of research about honeybees and keeping honeybees throughout the world. And I used her very, very much for this talk. If you open up the book, although it's difficult to find a copy of the book, it's about $160, and that's a reprint. They do on-demand reprints of older books, and this book, I didn't put down the date. It is somewhat older. It's all in black and white. So you'll notice the illustrations are all in black and white. And I took her pictures. She covered so much in this book. It is still the text on the history of beekeeping and honey hunting, even though it was written quite possibly 50 years ago or more. Her other book, Honey, is also the classic on honey. It is the standard on honey. That just came out in about a $40-some version, paperback, of the $80 hard print. Again, it's sort of a print on demand. And this one, they might actually be knowing that they can sell enough copies that they can keep it on hand. Print on demand is like you get you order a t-shirt and you want a slogan put on it. Well, apparently, instead of storing books in warehouses nowadays, they're scanning everything in digitally and they're printing it for you. Sort of like t-shirts, only a lot more involved, I would think. But she wrote these two great books. She is the authority, even in her death. She is well known. She wrote so much. These books are extremely detailed. She traveled the world, which was sort of unusual for a woman of her time. She was a young woman at World War II. I know she married. I don't think she ever had children, but she dedicated her life to all this research and putting together the information, getting people to talk to each other. She worked with Brother Adam and some other names that people who study the history of beekeeping recognize. And she went through the whole history. I don't have time to go through the whole chronology, but I think most of us kind of know that beekeeping started out with going out and raiding the beehives, right? Which we still do to a certain extent. but we like to think that we provide a happy, healthy environment for our bees while we're busy raiding the honey supply. But it started out with seeking, with hunting down the bees. Then there went to kind of attending. Then there came to the actual housing them in informal apiaries, and then the managing them, somewhat like livestock. Not to take the fun out of it for those of you who name your queens and you enjoy keeping bees. You like them. It is management. And throughout this book, there's a whole history of solutions to beekeeping issues. Well, there's the housing them. And there's how do you keep them secure and protect them from everybody else, as in every other critter that wants to take their honey or eat them. How do you control swarms? How do you super in a way that you can get the honey off later? You put supers on to try to keep the brood and the honey surplus separate, so it's easier for you to harvest some and leave enough for the bees. How do you get the best forage? By migrating, and the best crop pollination that way too. This has actually been a problem for thousands of years. Everything we do with bees is not new. And reading this book, I just really was going, wow, I got so excited. Too bad I don't get commissions on selling this. Although at $160, it's kind of like trying to sell an encyclopedia set. But it is, if you need to see it to see what a great book it is, and that people have been using the illustrations from this book without giving her credit. And she gave credit everywhere she could when she collected illustrations and articles and information and such. It is so detailed. If there's something you've ever wanted to know about the history of beekeeping, our relationship with the honeybee, and other bees too. She does not limit herself to the honeybees. The stingless bees that people have been mentioning recently, Australia, I don't know if she ever made it to Australia, but like the stingless bees that people were discussing, the social bees of Australia and such. And so all the solutions, and I looked at all this huge amount of information she had, and I finally had to pick a topic that was small enough that I could present it in about 45 minutes. And tools and equipment. I said, okay, I'll stick to that, to the small stuff. And I'd love to do another one on all the types of hives and all the ways that people have set up apiaries and all those things. But I said, okay, let's do tools. That would be kind of fun. So these are the big areas. And in the future, I would love to do hives, apiaries, how people manage their bees. And that has a lot to do with philosophy and such. And now we talk about monocultures and big egg and those kinds of concepts. But when you live with your bees, the concept that a lot of people live with their bees and have throughout history, and the whole migratory transport, that really does go back thousands of years to sailing, little Greek sailing ships sailing between the islands. Beekeepers backpacking their hives up to the alpine meadows every summer and back down again during the winter. So part of her book, the main emphasis of her book, is how do we get from this sort of bee harvesting, bee hunting, honey hunting. And here's a man, I think he's got his hand inside the cavity where the bees are, and he's up some rope or ladder. He's got bees flying all around. Ancient rock art, which she has a lot of in her book, the best collection you'll find. How do we get from that to almost 2 million hives that get carted down to Southern California to pollinate the almond harvest every year, and everything that's involved in the huge migratory commercial operations we have in the United States and in Canada, and fairly good sized ones in other parts of the world too. Okay, I would love to take on alternative hives, going back through history and saying, well, they used to be thicker walled, like these are Lands hives. And people have often said the thicker walls, the smaller entrances. I'm fascinated by this, and I want to do an entire one talk at some point, if I can get people to come, on her take, all the information she had on this. And she didn't take positions, she presented information. That was her personality, I think, quite a bit, was she wanted to get everybody the information they need. Never met her, but I think I would have loved meeting her. I would love to talk about beekeeping management. Would you believe this is one of those manuscript beekeeping calendars? I kid you not. Month by month, what needs to be done. It's very difficult to read because of the, what is that, Carolingian script? But beautiful, beautiful. And they were trying to figure out seasons and when you do what in beekeeping. Now, honey hunters, honey collectors, bee collectors knew all kinds of things about bees, even millions of years ago. And of course, we don't seem to know it until it's up and printed and collected and made into scientific data, except we do, right? You keep bees for a year and you feel like you start to know something. And the more years you keep them, the more you feel like you know. Tom Seeley is where you go for what cavity dwelling Apis mellifera does inside of feral hive range and where it goes into a tree. And these are diagrams out of Seeley here, Cecilia Morse. That's Tom Seeley, Honeybee Democracy author. I like his Wisdom of the Hive better. Again, it's a little pricey as a book but it seems like the good ones always are. I think it was over $100 because they called it a textbook. It would have been like 30 if they hadn't called it a textbook. And Morse, I can't remember his last name, but he is still active today. Ralph, I think. Here's a diagram of what we kind of know about how bees naturally organize, and we take advantage of this when we're stealing and when we're managing them. And it's really fun. I'm going to go through some of the equipment. I mean, how do you get your honey? Up a ladder. I cannot imagine this. Up a ladder, long pole with sharp edges at the end, a bucket, and you're trying to drop it into the bucket while hanging off this cliff. I think we have it much easier just worrying about a few stings. But this is how beekeeping started out. And from it came our understanding of where bees wanted to be kept. So out of this hunting and collecting comes what they call tending, keeping an eye on where the beehive is and harvesting a little every year, not taking it all. Some of the best aspects of foraging. Don't completely destroy the plant, the whole area that it grows. Just take enough that you can survive. Very environmentally sustainable. But the ways they did it were just totally incredibly dangerous, but people were good at it. Here is a ladder. You may not recognize that as a ladder. It doesn't even look like a very good green bean or pea support if I was gardening. But that's what it is. That is a ladder. Here's another ladder. And here's a fork stick for, I think, for pulling out the bees, for pulling out the comb. Now, this looks somewhat familiar if you think of linemen going up a telephone utility pole. Okay, but he's not doing it with any safety harnesses or nets or anything. And this is what we used to call pygmy. I think we now say San tribe of Africa, Southern Africa. And while you're doing this, you don't have any hands free. So you got to have like a shoulder bag out of bark or cow stomach, for example. And you swing that over your shoulder and just go up there. Well, after people knew where the bees were and were watching for the bees, when people started collecting the bees especially, but even when they were just trying to get the honey, they started looking at bee lines. And those of us who have bees, we already know bees make a beeline. For as soon as they're loaded and they have what they want, they head for their hive. And when we watch them come out, we watch them kind of come up, orient to the sun, and take off to wherever the big draw of the day is, wherever the big nectar or pollen source of the day is. So back in her histories, she shows you what people did. Okay, this sounds funny. They would trap a certain number of bees, and they would maybe release. They trap the bees. So they have these little boxes and traps. I think the next slide, a whole bunch of little traps. People would trap bees. Maybe put a little nectar in there, grab and wait until some bees got in there. In feral situations, they could assume that they came from the same hive, probably a good chance. So you would trap a number of bees, you would release one here and see which way it went. Then I guess you would go over here and you would release one, if I understand this, and then maybe someplace else. And you would take eventually, sort of like triangulation, you would figure out where the hive had to be, assuming all your bees are from the same hive. I'm not sure I could ever do this, but feral hives are spaced a certain distance apart, and they sort of maintain that distance. Tom Seeley just studied that. So people had to have something they could put that little bit of honey in, trap some bees inside, and they used anything at hand. It's kind of interesting what they did. And you got to keep the bees alive, but that's not too hard. These are porous enough. There's some air that could get in. You could use anything you had around, any kind of pod or a stick you could hollow out or a horn, anything like that. And then after people found them, or they decided that they wanted to start collecting them, like collecting swarms, they moved from the hunting, collecting phase to the tending phase. And so this is where we kind of get into, they keep the bees where the bees naturally want to be. They're cavity dwellers, Apis mellifera. Every time somebody says that a honeybee nest is in the ground, you get real suspicious, right? You say, wait a minute, is that really a honeybee? Send me a picture. And sometimes it is, but when you find a honeybee in the ground, there's a cavity there of some kind. They have found a water main box, or they found something that's a cavity that they're actually dwelling in. They don't excavate a cavity. They can modify the inside of a tree or something, a certain amount. But basically, they're looking for a cavity. So if they are in the ground, it's actually they're in the cavity. But usually it's in tree, a cave, those sorts of situations. Well, this led to bees picked a good place, very secure. I'd love to talk about that in another talk, just about we have to provide everything that the bees provided for themselves and a little more if we want to harvest surplus honey. So at first, people tended the bees by leaving them where they were, and they'd make marks or piles of stones and such in front of their hives. But they got to get to them. Exactly what made those hives so secure from other predators made them difficult for people to get to. So people developed all kinds of systems. They developed, here's a hole. It's a hollowed out tree. And as beekeepers got more and more into tending, they would actually take a swarm and put it inside of a cavity like this. They'd cut off a part of the tree, hollow out the inside if it wasn't already rotted out, start putting bees in there, but now you got to get to it. Well, I guess these people were the pioneers who later came to America. They must have had the same spirit as the people who crossed the plains without knowing where the next water supply was in Conestoga wagons. It's all I can think of. They must have been true pioneers, because here they are going up and down trees with just some ropes, maybe a little bit of a seat to sit on. This man has a little bit of a climber seat, and he hauls himself up. Some used braces with hooks on them, the same way that linemen do to get up telephone utility poles. Dug the hooks in. Here's some of them. Somebody's crazy, I guess. It has the advantage of you didn't have to worry about protecting the bees from bears or skunks or anything else. And who else is going to rob out the honey? After people found that where bees like to be, they kept doing it. Then they would start hollowing out logs and hanging them. Here's one of those sort of, you pull yourself up over the rope. Eventually, I assume they came up and started putting pulleys there to make it a little easier, and hauled themselves up, or had somebody else help haul them up to tend the bees this way. So they started using all of these different tools to manage bees. Oh, this was odd because the pests throughout the book, you find that they had the same pests that we have problems with. Wax moth. I discovered after someone mentioned it online that those electric bug zapper that emit the blue light that zaps mosquitoes works really well for wax moth. I now have one on a timer to come on like an hour a day at night when the bees aren't there. Can come on in the evening, is perfect. And it seems to keep wax moth way down. It doesn't get into your comb. That's what they're doing in this picture here with the lanterns at night. They're killing wax moths. Same problem. And I never realized until I just looked at it today that they had found the same solution, except that I'm using an electric bug zapper. A lot of things that we think are modern, like movable frames and top bar wedges, and when we get into types of hives, which I almost think I should have done first, but the spacing, we talk about bee spacing, trying to limit the bee comb that's not where you want it, the burr, brace, bridge comb. You try to level your hive, you do all these things. Well, for thousands of years, people have known about that. And one thing they discovered when they started looking at the hives that Egyptians, and we're talking back a few thousand years, at least 2, going into 3,000 years ago, the Egyptians kept bees in what they had, which was clay, long clay tube pots, basically. And that's why in the old beekeeping, the very few Egyptian paintings or drawings that they have found, they are taking out their comb in round circles. It's not pancakes. That is the way it comes out when you have the bees make the comb in a way that you can easily harvest from the back. Now, the bees might have gone the other way. They might have gone the length of the tube, but to get them to go the width of the tube, I don't know what genius figured it out, but they figured out that if you make grooves, if it's a wood log, you make grooves. You could use little strips like we do with a top bar wedge. I should have put a picture here for people who don't think top bar, but foundationless beekeeping, foundationless frames, they had the same idea. They would take in the next and put either a little line of beeswax, a little strip of wood, a little groove, or they'd make that groove. I think it's the next one. Where did I put it? Here it is. If you were to unroll one of these cylindrical hives that may still be used today, they definitely were still used in the 50s, 60s, 70s when Eva Crane was getting these pictures and getting these diagrams, putting everything into the book. You will find that there's little incisions on the inside. So if you unroll this is a link, front to back, you'll find these lines. I assume they made them when the clay was wet. If they didn't make them when the clay was wet, they put a little strip of wood or a line of beeswax, just enough to make the bees think about drawing out their comb that way. And so that's how they end up with round comb from these long hives laid on their sides. And that is why the tools that even today are used, because this is a system that is still used today, long, narrow hives, and they do them in walls, they do them in the walls of their houses. Actually, people actually keep bees in the walls of their houses, in caves, they actually pile these up and make apiaries by piling these cylindrical hives. They're not always clay or pottery. Some are rolled mats covered with clay and all different systems. Her book is fascinating. I never knew there were that many ways to make a hive and that many different things to make it out of. And when you do that, you need a certain type of bee tool. And here they are. Here's some long, if you were a top bar person, this would look really familiar. They say get a long icing knife, the commercial kitchen icing spatula type knives, if you are doing top bar. because you need to loosen the sides. Okay, now to get these out, these combs, they had to loosen the sides. So you reach far in, and even to this day, they still use these somewhat. And this actually, I think it's a face mask, a protective mesh, and then a hood that goes over the clothes. See, it's about 1950s that she was taking a lot of these pictures. Before a lot of things disappeared, which is one of the great things about her book. This is one of the most famous wall paintings that is represented in drawings about beekeeping in ancient times. And you have to read it in case you're going, I don't quite get what they're doing. You have to remember, you have to read right to left, not the Roman way to do it, but the Arabic, Semitic, Hebrew, everything in that area, Middle East, you read right to left. So here we have cylindrical hives. They're harvesting. They're pouring out the honey. I think that's what they're showing here is flowing honey. Not quite sure what this shows, if that's some kind of straining. Putting it into huge jars, pitchers. I think they may be making mead here. I would kind of suspect with the pitchers that this is fermenting, and then storing. Don't totally understand it, but you read it from right to left, and then it makes some sense. And here is someone making an offering to the pharaoh of those round honeycombs. And I wonder if that's mead that's in the liquid, looks like a liquid container there. There were all kinds of tools. Okay, those Egyptian ones kind of look like the ones that are used traditionally in Crete. Again, this is still in the 20th century, still using these with, it says they've got double-ended cutter. So this cuts both ways. You're reaching down into often wicker type hives, tubular hives, usually laid on their sides, which seems a little odd, but top bar, people do top bar and Langston longs today. Here's a fork type end, a scraper, and then some blades. I could see how that would really help in a hive to have that kind of a tool. It's nice to imagine. Here's a queen excluder. I thought that was just really neat. They knew bee space and the width of bees and such, and yeah. This is a set of tools used by a tree climbing honey collector in Sumatra, and they get up the trees. I don't know if it's, it may not be in the next slide or two. They get up the trees by taking a mallet, which is a hardwood mallet, and driving pegs in, much like a mountaineer works his or her way up a mountainside by driving in the pegs and fastening the carabiner clip and going up. But this is without, of course, any safety ropes or anything like that. Very interesting. So you knock these pegs in and you climb up the tree. People do like their sweets, though. More pictures. This is a very common thing on the incisions that they found. Different ways. These are quite old. I don't think it gives a date here. It just says ancient hives. This has been for as long as people have had bees. They figured out how to manage their bees. Kind of getting into the protective wear with a few comments on top bar hives. See these sticks across? Beekeepers figured out long before top bars became popular in the United States, and actually popular somewhat in England and other places. They came from the tropics, but here is a man in Crete, and he has these straw hackles covering his wicker hives, but over the top, he didn't let the bees just do whatever. He gave them a guide, and you bet he knows how to space these. The experienced beekeepers know how to space these, and then when they pick one up, it does those long tools you just saw, the long tools from Crete, and loosen it up around the edges, and here you are. Beautiful comb honey. I noticed that he doesn't trust the bees not to sting him, though. See that face mask? I don't know what that one's made out of. This one here is iron wire, clay pipe. Smoking was originally done with torches, a handful of bark or grass or something, and then pipes. Beekeepers smoked pipes. Even if they didn't inhale, they blew the smoke in. It was the easiest way. And that's why you'll find this hole. And this one has like a tab that swings over the hole when you're not actually sticking the pipe in. Although my dad smoked a pipe, and pipes are a little bit tricky to keep lit sometimes. You do have to keep puffing on it. He used to make this noise all the time when he was puffing his pipe. Okay. How long have they been using smoke? We haven't changed it. It's still our basic bee calming, aggression dampening go-to. We're still doing it here on how old is this? They don't know exactly. It's Zimbabwe cave paintings, but they're basically showing that people have been doing this smoking. Here's the bees coming in and out of the hive. And here's someone holding the smoking weeds, grass, whatever. And this is a really weird representation of a beehive. If you look at that, you go, what is that? It looks gross. That's actually, if you are coming up and you're going to harvest cavity dwelling bees, you're coming up underneath them. That's what your bee combs look like from the bottom. If there was ever any doubt on some of these old cave paintings that the people went there and harvested the bee comb, they didn't just knock it down into the dirt, which would have been a problem. They went up there and they got it and harvested it to get it good and clean. This is how you know, because you can only see this view of beehives when you are up there underneath them, looking straight into them. That is your combs from the bottom. Smokers, after people got tired of, I don't know, you probably get some burnt fingers. And of course, you're sniffing it too, despite the fact you're trying not to inhale. People went to different types of smokers, and pottery was an automatic. Here's one. This one is about 1790. Didn't change a lot, except that now we've got something holding it. Calming the bees. Here's another smoker. We're pretty sure that's what that is. Sometimes an archaeologist is looking at a piece of pottery and not sure what it is. But depending on where the holes are, sometimes you can figure it out. And that handle would be very useful for holding a hot pot. I can see how that would work. Another clay pipe. Here's a pipe, long stemmed. This one, I think, this is copper wire for a faceplate that would be sewed onto cloth. And here is seems like overkill, but it's a bellows to blow enough air to get a lot of smoke to smoke out this skep here. And finally, we have the smoker we know today. And then once we found a good model, it's like the Langstroth Hive, we seem to have stuck with it. Oh dear, a second, someone needs in. The Quimby smoker, 1873, and we are still using basically that design. Although we kind of turned the bellows upside down. This I thought was really interesting. This is a smoking state-of-the-art in 1842 stupefier. You probably heard people say they're interested in the idea of, well, what if I put herbs or something? It would be more calming to the bees. I mean, if chamomile is calming for people, would it be calming for bees? How about lavender? One of the essential oils. Is there something that would mask alarm pheromone better, calm them? And people have suggested that cannabis might be one of those things. Well, this is not cannabis because I don't think they knew about it yet in Europe in 1842. But this is puffballs, which were known to be apparently a stupefactant for people. So puffballs, the kind of mushroom that puffs up, they were smoking those. I don't know if the beekeepers were enjoying them too, but they say it helped with the bees. It was a theory, and there are people who are, although there's no research to support making your bees high on pot is going to help. Still, some people say it's worth trying. Ladders. I did quickly talk about ladders. These are all kinds of crazy ladders. They really seriously were crawling up underneath the bees, again, because you can tell by the way you're seeing the bottoms of the combs that this is the way they were harvesting. There's that guy. He's crazy. He's up in Nepal, hanging there on some rope stick ladder. But crazy as it was, it worked. Here's a Persian honey collector. This is 1991, and he's still wearing traditional gear, traditional ropes with long tools to reach in, some straps, climbing belt. I think that's a climbing belt there. This is fairly recent, and this is a ladder up a tree in Thailand to get up there and collect your 10. Here's beekeepers deliberately tending their hives up above. Again, there's that swing, and you raise yourself up and down. Ladders. This is all kinds of diagrams on how people do it. I don't know if this guy here with his hands up intends to catch that beekeeper if he falls. I would assume he's trying to catch the comb or something, or he's going to lower down, maybe using this device. He's going to lower down what he harvests to him. And nobody likes to get stung. It is interesting to me to see that we haven't changed a lot. But here's so I think that one was iron. Here's a horsehair insert. So horsehair was used for an awful lot of things. Everybody had horses, and those hairs, those individual hairs are very tough. And people braided them. They made stuff called horsehair braid. It was really interesting what they did. And they still have those awful ties. I assume in this case, you're tying around the sleeve so the bees can't get up. And again, tying around maybe the waist or right under your arms. And if you ever tried one of those old tie-on hoods, you're sitting there going, what do I do with these strings? Okay, they tied to seal. They didn't have elastic. That was a later invention. And they don't look real happy about it, but this is appropriate beekeeper wear. I assume the long skirts, a lot of women were beekeepers, a lot. And I assume the long skirts worked quite a bit because they were so long. If you wore a short skirt, I think bees could get under there and we could all be doing the bee dance, But I think with the long skirts, the hem was so close to the ground, bees seldom crawl up your leg. If they get really ticked off, if you dumped enough bees on the ground, yes. But basically, if you're working on your hives, bees do tend to fly up. Your face is warmer, the CO2 is up here, they're going to go up usually. So I guess it worked because a lot of women did beekeeping in skirts. Doesn't that look really familiar? The round veil. And this is really old. I mean, look, he's wearing tights and tunics like Robin Hood days or something. And he's collecting a swarm into probably the lid of a skep. And he's probably going to take it and put it on the skep. The basket woven like this. Any kind of loose woven fabric was better than nothing. Even if it was wicker, still better than nothing. And this is, I guess, state-of-the-art beekeeping wear. Long sleeves, hoping that the bees will be distracted, won't get all the way inside. Long skirt-type tunics. Tanging, that's interesting. I don't know if that's really beekeeping equipment. The concept that bees react to vibrations and sounds and might settle, that's the theory that people give for tanging. Tanging is you beat and you want a swarm to settle. It's up in the air. And if you beat, supposedly, the story is they're going to think that a thunderstorm is coming and they're going to settle. What I really think was happening is that if you weren't making a noise while you're chasing your swarm, there's a good chance somebody's going to shoot you or attack you because you're trespassing on their property. To this day, in some European countries, if you can keep the swarm leaving your hive in sight, it is your swarm. So you're trying to get there before it goes out of your sight. They have interesting beekeeping laws. That's a whole neat talk in itself. Who do the bees belong to? How do you know who owns what? If you neglect a hive, does the next person that wants to put bees in that cavity, do they get that little cavity or apiary or whatever? This is where it's a whole family affair. Look at everybody has net over their face. Everybody's got kind of hoods, even the kid. I think that's a kid deck there. And everybody's active. Looks a little chaotic. again, tanging, beating the pots and pans to make that vibration that supposedly makes this swarm that's taking off. I hope they can run fast because it looks like it's taken off to me. And he might be trying to actually scoop a swarm in. That's what that looks like on the outside of the bark there. This is 1580. The dates on some of these woodcuts and such are interesting. Again, some of the beekeeping equipment has not substantially changed. Here we have the broad brim, much like a round veil coming down, hanging loosely. This was an advertisement for Dr. Pine's woven wire veils, which won first prize for the best bee dress in 1879. In the late 1800s, particularly, it became very popular in Europe, England, Germany, and such, for everybody to keep bees. It became not just a poor person's hobby, but an educated person's hobby. It was even recommended that the lady of the house keep bees, to which I probably would have said, forget it in those days. On top of everything else, you want me to do all the laundry by hand, cook from scratch. Anyway, okay, back on topic. But it's interesting. People tried all these different ways to keep the bees from stinging, and they do go for your heat, your CO2, your eyes, because they recognize the face of a predator. Generalized, instinctually seem to recognize a face. This is an interesting beekeeping jacket. Look at this one. There's a little hole which you probably can't see, which is to put the pipe in. Isn't this incredible? Look at this. What's it made? It doesn't say what it's actually made out of. But somebody got tired of getting stung, I can tell you that. Or they had very aggressive bees. Oh, I'll go into this another time. It is interesting, though, how much people knew about bee space and trying to do what that little beekeeper in Crete did by putting the sticks on top of the wicker hive basket. What he did, people are doing very complex things to do today to try to space their frames apart. Shoulders, we call them on frames, and trying to keep things in line and space things out. I'd love to go into that more another time. But here we get down to the harvest. Now there's the crush and extract. And I'm sure you can make wicker strainers, but it could be good to keep the really big pieces out. And if you take your time and let things settle, this is one type of honey strainer, just holds in a pottery. And you can wash pottery pretty well and keep it pretty clean, reuse it. And then there's if you were going to extract it and start using mechanical extractors, you start getting into how to uncap. This uncapping knife, 1879, looks very much like one I have that someone gave me, except that mine has a little electric cord and it's a heated uncapping knife. This over here is a apparatus before electricity. This is a steam heated. Apparently, some people really didn't like uncapping and sitting there and doing it. So they had, this looks like a little alcohol lamp or some kind of gas lamp. And then you heat it. Okay, this all must go together. I think this goes on top of this, goes on top of this. And the water in here heats up, comes through and heats the heated decapping knife. Looks very interesting. Oh, this is something that we've been doing for a long time. This is a 1956 picture, but it's been done before that. Harvesting royal jelly and getting the bees to produce extra queen cells on hives. It's done to this day. China does it. There's a good video on YouTube of how to harvest royal jelly out of extra queen cells, or in this case, it says artificial. So they've used a system where they fooled the bees into thinking that it's a queen cell. And their harvest is sucking out the little bit of royal jelly because it's worth, I don't know how much per fraction of an ounce, but it's a lot of money because so many people are interested in the fountain of youth promised by royal jelly, or the health benefits as a food supplement. Wax extracting. I put this in because I had forgotten how much people did with presses. This looks suspiciously like the Gutenberg printing press, doesn't it? Does anyone else remember in their history book the picture of the Gutenberg printing press? Changed world history. This is a beeswax press. You put the wax inside of something that is like a sack, like sacking, and then heat it up. It's warm, and then push it through that straining fabric or material. That's the plan for here. This one makes more sense to me, although presses were used for a lot of things. Remember, you had wine presses, all kinds of presses. It's not something we do so much nowadays. We steam extract, we do all kinds of things, but this is the good old-fashioned, this screw here, you crank, it comes down, it pushes down, it presses. This is a wax extractor using water. I assume hot water. Wax floats, okay, sort of like solar collectors, kind of counting on things will float, and there'll be layers, and then I assume you'll be able to skim. Honey harvesting. Everybody loves their sweets. This is when fixed frame, movable frames come in. As soon as they start to come in, people realize they're not going to have to melt out all the wax and deal with it. They can just get the honey out if they can uncap. This is a single frame extractor. You twirl it. There's the frame, and I don't have the diagram. It's in the book of how you do this. It explains how you spin this. And that was so arduous, people rapidly went to larger extractors. Some of the extractors, when people did start using movable frames, nobody used the same size. So some of these were meant to accommodate all different sizes. And I mean, there were some large ones that they were meant to accommodate. And this is a radial. You don't have to turn the frames because everything's going to spin outward. If you put the top of the frame here and the bottom toward the center. And you are now out of the crush and extract that the Egyptians would have had to do. One of the great developments in bee tools is shipping bees. And this became really important in the United States because of shipping bees and being able to ship them even across the Atlantic at the turn of the century, back 1900s type turn of the century, ended up with us getting stocks from various places, especially Italian bees. Did I put the Italian Queen advertisement here? No, I didn't. I was going to. About 1900, I think Root, it just always goes by his initial, A. Root, of the Dedant Company, which still exists and still sells bee supplies and bees. They brought in a lot of Italian queens, and then they shipped them in little cages all over the United States, I'm sure with attendants, because the mail wasn't that fast in those days. I've heard it's going to slow down again. But when they did that, they got Italian genetics into the American beekeeping stock. And the reason they were doing it was because Italians were more resistant to European foul brood, which was sort of the varroa mite of its time. A lot of bees just could not do well with European foul brood. It's in the cool, damp springs, especially if you live in an area that has cool, damp springs. But the Italians were more resistant to it. So if you get an Italian queen into your apiary and breed off her, then you started to get the genetics in. Later on, it may have saved the US honeybee industry because those Italians also had resistance to tracheal mite, because it had been prevalent, I guess, in the Mediterranean area they came from. Italy is there in the Mediterranean area. So this made all kinds of things possible in beekeeping in the United States, but going way back before that, people could trade queens, trade genetics, requeen a hive, and they used lots of little tiny queen cages. These are some from Ethiopia and Eritrea. People knew a lot about bees really early. These are later packages and such, but it's the same concept that people knew how to make the right kind of mesh to move bees around. If you can move the queen, so much the better. In a lot of what we're doing and a lot of what I was noticing as I went through the book was we're going back to the same kinds of hives. And I want to write a whole another presentation on that. I think that's the most that I could get organized by today. I'd love to go through some and see some of this. Is there anything in here that, no, this is all different types of hives I would love to talk to. How to micro-targeted beekeeping for thousands of years, going way back. Yeah, I would love to do a whole nother talk on that, but I think I'd probably better stop because I tend to talk too long. And this is a fascinating book. Eva Crane, let's see, I don't think I've got anything else that's really interesting, except for the fact that the bees in Washington, in the West Coast, came around the horn of South America. They came all the way around by sailing ship. They couldn't cross the Rockies. Bees could not by themselves cross the Rockies. So they didn't get to about California until 1850. And as far as anyone knows, there were not honeybees in west of the Rockies, and definitely in our area until late 1800s. And they had to do it by water cooling the hives. They had to keep them cool because they were keeping them so confined. And as those of us who've transported bees worry, we don't want them to asphyxiate, and the hotter they are, the more storage they use up. We're worrying about that right now with winterization, aren't we? They are too active. I worry right now that my bees are way too active. It may be rainy, cloudy, there's no nectar source out there, but they're staying really active, bringing in pollen that I'm not convinced they need. I just think you have a lot of unemployed foragers out there. But there's a whole strategy that they used on the sailing ships to water cool with seawater, sort of a double, it's like a double boiler, but it's a double cooler, two shell with the circulating the seawater between the two sleeves, the jacket, that's what you would call it. Okay, I had better stop because I'm sure somebody really wants to talk about winterization, but and thank you so much for listening. This was really fun. And I probably should stop the recording. I want to make sure people feel free to talk.